Welcome to K-12 Budget Committee, and we today are going to be talking about critical pedagogy. Before we dive into our topic today, I would like to welcome one of our members that is substituting for our ranking member, and so welcome Representative Hesswood for being here today. We appreciate that. We do have some members that are online today, and so Representative Huber, Representative Tarwater, and Landwehr, I believe. So Representative Hoffman, if you'll let me know if any of those individuals have questions, then that will keep things rolling. Committee, are there any introductions of bills? Representative Penn.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to introduce a bill on education savings account. It has the RS number RS2744.
Introductions, others? Representative Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I also would like to introduce House Bill with the number RS 2736.
All right, two bills have been introduced. If there are no objections, then they are now formally introduced to the committee. Any other items, any other RS numbers? Yes, Representative Owsley.
Maybe the revisor, Nick, do you recall the RS number? As we were talking about learning loss, I decided that it would be a good idea to have the option for schools to go remote as the Omicron variant is running through our state. So the bill would strike the 40-hour remote language from last year's bill that we passed. RS 2717.
RS 2717 has been submitted and introduced. Any others? All right, committee, great. We have our introductions, and we'll now go ahead and move to our panel discussion. I would like to lay forth the rules of the panel and what our goals are today, and introduce our four panelists. First, I will just start with a description of what our aim is. Our aim is for us today to look at critical pedagogy and try to understand what is it and does it exist in our schools. So critical pedagogy is really the application of any type of critical theory that may be applied in various formats, perhaps in our schools. One definition of critical pedagogy is a teaching philosophy that assumes structure of power and oppression, assumes people are unfree, and urges people to be activists. So this is also, critical pedagogy is a philosophy of education and social movement that developed and applied concepts from critical theory and related traditions in the field of education. So I think the question that is coming to this committee from our parents, from our school districts, is what type of critical pedagogy is being applied in our schools today, and what evidence do we have of that? One interim conferee said it is a verb, not a noun. So we're not looking at a particular legal theory, we're looking at something that's actually applied in our classrooms. So to have that discussion, we have, with the help and the assistance of my ranking member and Representative Owsley, we put together four panelists. And so I appreciate their help in the invitations that exist here today. So we have David Smith, who will be sharing with us first. He is from Shawnee Mission School District, and he's been invited to specifically talk about deep equity and his work with DEI. We also have Tamara Saylor James. She's a private citizen, and she, I believe her children go to the Blue Valley School District, and she can correct me on that, if that's that correct?
3 graduated, 1 is still.
Okay, perfect. We also have Mark McCormick. He's the Director of Strategic Communications for the ACLU of Kansas, member of the Kansas African American Affairs Commission, member of the Governor's Commission on Racial Equity and Justice. And so he's here as well today. So we are very happy to have you. And finally, we have Denise Roberts, and she is also a private citizen from the Johnson County area. And so each of them are going to provide 10 minutes of testimony. After the completion of their 10 minutes of testimony, we'll let them know your time is up. Thank you. And they can return to their seats. And then after that 40 minutes has expired, then what we're going to do is we'll start with Representative Owsley, and we'll work our way around the committee room. It's incumbent on time. I don't want to keep us here until 7 o'clock at night. So it is incumbent upon time. But I would like for each of you to be able to ask at least one question, a concise question that the entire panel is able to answer. Panel, in order to do this expeditiously, you're going to have to come up to the microphone, and as soon as you know the other person's closing, you're going to need to be there. Otherwise, we'll never finish, and the questions will end somewhere about right here. And this side of the room won't have an opportunity to ask a question. So concise question, concise answer, and so that everybody has that opportunity. Then the final goal is to allow you a couple minutes to make some closing statements, to kind of wrap up your thoughts on the discussion. Remember, everything is supposed to center around our kids in K-12 here in the state of Kansas. So we would like you to kind of direct your thoughts towards that if you can. Any questions from the committee about, or the panel? And I'm going to ask my assistant, my vice chair, to kind of keep the clock for us on the 10 minutes. And he'll give you a warning, and that will be 1 minute. 1 minute warning. So if you'll look at Representative Hoffman, he'll give you that. And again, thank you so much for having a respectful, courteous discussion, because I think some of the biggest problems come from misunderstanding and not knowing and how to communicate. And so let's get on the same page for that, and then let's do what's best for Kansas kids. And with that, we're going to invite David Smith. You are first. Welcome to K-12, and thank you for giving your time.
Thank you, Chairwoman Williams, members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you. My name is David Smith. I am the Chief Communications Officer for the Shawnee Mission School District, and I'm here to talk about our work. You have my testimony in front of you, and I don't want to repeat anything that's there because I think that's clear. I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about the why, about where this work comes from and why it's so important. And I want to do that. I want to begin by talking personally about my own background and experience. I grew up in a district smaller than Shawnee Mission, but a very diverse district, a district that had wide populations in terms of ethnicity, race, language, and all of those things. I did quite well. The district and the way that they taught worked for me. I had certain advantages growing up. I had parents who graduated from college. My mother was a physician. My grandfather was a physician. Those were significant advantages. When I went to school, the ways in which they taught worked well for me. I was somebody who, when someone could stand up and lecture, I was motivated. I was connected to the culture of many of my teachers, and it worked well, and I did well. There were also students for whom the way that things were taught didn't work. There were students who were really challenged to engage in the school, to feel connected to the school in ways that allowed them to be successful. And some of my friends who had the same skills and intelligence as I did didn't do well in school. That was okay, because I grew up at a time, I'm a lot older than most of the people in this room, I grew up at a time when society had places for children who didn't do well in school academically. There were jobs, there were ways for them to be successful. Things have changed profoundly. That back then, we didn't expect all kids to be successful. Now we do. In Shawnee Mission, beginning in 2019, we began a strategic planning process to determine what our goals and our work as a district would be for the next 5 years. And this was a community-based process. So this allowed the community to set the direction for the Shawnee Mission School District. And the community was very clear. We expect all students to be successful. That's our expectation. Each student will graduate high school prepared for college and careers with the interpersonal skills that they need to be successful. Every single student. They said that when we went through the strategic planning process, they were very clear. And my superintendent, previous superintendent, said to us many times, we're going to trust our community. The wisdom lies within our community. Our community set forth for us some very clear beliefs. Every individual has inherent worth and deserves to be valued and celebrated. A community's strength is derived from its diversity. Respecting a community's diversity and each individual's dignity demands equitable access. A thriving community meets the basic physical, social, and emotional needs of its members. Safe and caring relationships are essential for learning and growth. These are things that our community strongly believes, and our work follows that. When we look at our mission, one of the language we use is about having an inclusive community. That is critical to what Shawnee Mission believes. We also talk about having an engaged community. So we believe very strongly that we need to connect to our community, to listen to those voices, and we continue to have opportunities to do that. We have 5 strategies for our work. In this context, the one that's most important is we said we will relentlessly create a fully unified, equitable, and inclusive culture. Fully unified, equitable, and inclusive culture. That's the expectation from our community. We also put parameters around the work. We said that we will honor our diversity and treat each person with dignity and respect. So for us, when we think about our work and how we do this, we know that we can't continue to do education in the ways in which it was done previously when we didn't meet the needs of all students. Our community expects more from us. The work we do with deep equity is designed to create relationships and a sense of belonging and connection for each one of our students. It's work that is done with our teaching staff so that they, and we as the adults in the system, can do our work differently in a manner that does allow every student, regardless of background or experiences, to feel that sense of connection. That's incumbent upon us as the adults in the room. We've got to figure out ways to make sure that we're connecting to all of our students, and we're giving them the space and doing the things that make sure to draw them in. And that's what the work of deep equity is about, building those connections. It's work with adults. So that's, I mean, we're the teachers, we're the professionals, we're the ones who can do that work. And when we do it, and we do it well, all of our students will find a way to be connected, and through those connections, a way to success. We take that work seriously. That's what our community expects of us. And I'll be glad to talk with more detail about that at the appropriate time.
Thank you, David. And I forgot to give a disclaimer at the beginning of this. Though we have 2 districts that are represented here today, it by no means is about just 2 districts. There should not be a spotlight on any one district for this topic. This topic is a topic of interest across the state of Kansas, across the United States. So please do not feel picked on if your particular school district is highlighted here today. Next committee, we have Tamara Saylor-James. Welcome.
Very much, Chairperson Williams, Vice Chairperson Hoffman, members of the committee. My name is Tamara Saylor-James. I'm a parent in the Blue Valley School District, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak to you today to share what I have learned about the impact of critical race theory on our schools. We have been told by our Kansas Department of Education, by a member of the State Board of Education, by major Kansas news outlets, and even my own Blue Valley School District, that critical race theory is taught in graduate schools and is used primarily in law schools and has no bearing on elementary or secondary schools. In other words, move along, there is nothing to see here. My goal today is to demonstrate that on the contrary, there is plenty to see in our Kansas schools, both in professional development and in the classroom. Outside observers have long known there's something unique about the United States. 100 years ago, the English writer G.K. Chesterton visited America and wrote about our Declaration of Independence that America is the only nation in the world founded on a creed. It's a creed of liberty, equality, and justice for all. This nation never has been and never will be perfect, but our constitutional order contains the mechanisms for societal improvement. The United States remains a beacon of hope to people from around the world who continue to migrate here by the millions. And even in Kansas, more than 100 languages are spoken among the state's school children because their parents came here for a better life. So if the American idea is quasi-religious in origin, I think it's fair to say a counter-religion called critical theory opposes it. Critical thinkers want to disrupt what exists rather than working within systems for societal improvement. And that's because they view those systems as irremediably flawed. And critical race theory, a primarily American application of critical theory, puts race at the center of its worldview. And just as the United States has founding fathers and mothers, critical race theory also has its founding fathers and mothers. And initially, they were law school professors. So among them, the late Derek Bell of Harvard Law School, his protege, Kimberly Crenshaw, who is now at UCLA and Columbia, and she coined the term critical race theory, and Richard Delgado, who is now at Alabama Law. But this does not prove that CRT is merely graduate-level legal theory. Here are the words of the very same Richard Delgado speaking of himself and his wife and his co-author, Jean Stefanczyk. He says, "Seeing critical race theory take off in education has been a source of great satisfaction for the two of us. Critical race theory is in some ways livelier in education right now than it is in law." Delgado made these comments more than a decade ago, and he's not wrong. CRT did begin in law schools, but its second wave of thinkers includes Gloria Ladson-Billings, who is now a professor emerita of education at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Robin DiAngelo, the author of White Fragility, who is an affiliate associate professor at the University of Washington College of Education, and Barbara Applebaum, who is the author of Being White, Being Good, White Complicity, White Moral Responsibility, and Social Justice Pedagogy. She is professor at Syracuse University School of Education. Therefore, to say that CRT is used largely in law schools is demonstrably false. So we need to know, what is critical race theory? Delgado and Stefanczyk, in their book Critical Race Theory and Introduction, say CRT seeks to transform the relationship among race, racism, and power. And further, in a passage that takes aim at our constitutional order, that unlike traditional civil rights discourse, which stresses incrementalism and step-by-step progress, critical race theory questions the very foundations of the liberal order, including equality theory, legal reasoning, enlightenment, rationalism, and neutral principles of constitutional law. Major CRT themes include white privilege and white collective guilt, the idea that, quote, racism is pervasive, systemic, and deeply ingrained. CRT emphasizes identity and intersectionality, thoughts and feelings, unconscious discrimination, stereotype threat, implicit associations, and the use of personal narratives. These themes and terms recur wherever CRT exerts influence, and that includes in our Kansas K-12 schools, as we shall see. So-called systemic racism and collective white guilt are the entire premise of Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility, and she writes of our children that a racism-free upbringing is not possible because racism is a social system embedded in the culture and in its institutions. And perhaps no author is more prominent today than Dr. Ibram X. Kendi, the author of several books, including the bestseller How to Be an Anti-Racist and the children's picture book Anti-Racist Baby. According to Dr. Kendi, any measure that produces or sustains racial inequity between racial groups is a racist policy. Further, he believes there is no such thing as a non-racist or race-neutral policy. He also has no ethical difficulty with so-called discrimination if it yields the equity, and that is the equal outcomes that he seeks. Dr. Kendi and his definition of anti-racism loom large both in popular culture and in education circles. So against this backdrop, we can recognize the inroads that CRT has made into our Kansas K-12 public schools. First, professional development. So in 2019, the Shawnee Mission School District did hire a coordinator of diversity, equity, inclusion, and did launch the Deep Equity Professional Development Program that you have just heard alluded to. The 5 phases of deep equity incorporate all the major themes of critical race theory. For example, Phase 2 is described as, quote, particularly important for white folks who often do not see themselves as racial or cultural beings, even if their stories involve periods of ignorance, bias, or disconsciousness. Phase 2 activities require faculty and staff to label themselves according to identity categories, then pretend they live in a police state where they must suppress part of their identity in order to, quote, create awareness of the ways that power, privilege, and oppression can impact personal identity. In Phase 3, the training manual says, quote, the system of social dominance and privilege that was established by the Founding Fathers and perpetuated over the centuries is still living with us in our classrooms. An activity in that phase called the guessing game has as its purpose to examine school culture and outcomes through the lens of privilege, power, and social dominance, and acknowledge the deeper dynamics of privilege and power that have created and perpetuated educational inequities. And Deep Equity also has a program for students called Youth Equity Stewardship, or YES. It applies these same principles and is scheduled to begin training children sometime this year. In 2019, the Olathe Public Schools established their Department of Diversity and Engagement, and that same year promoted an interactive critical conversations workshop for teachers run by the Teaching Tolerance Project of the Southern Poverty Law Center. Participants would, among other things, explore strategies for facilitating critical conversations with students and colleagues, investigate methods of teaching about implicit bias, race, and other critical topics. Now, that project has since been rebranded as Learning for Justice, so Teaching Tolerance has become Learning for Justice. And its magazine for the spring 2021 edition on its website states that, quote, we know white supremacy is woven into the fabric of American culture and society. It's also woven into our education system. Turning to Blue Valley, from late 2018 to September 2020, Blue Valley implemented its all-personnel training related to diversity and specifically implicit bias. By the summer of 2020, the district had created a Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Board Advisory Committee, and teachers received a list of diversity, equity, inclusion, and anti-racism resources that included such items as the Aspen Institute Structural Racism Glossary, which, for example, applies a structural racism filter to the so-called national values of the United States. And it claims that these values of personal responsibility and individualism have allowed structural racism to exist in ways that are hard to detect. I know I'm running out of time, so I will turn briefly to the curriculum, where I have noticed that in the English language arts curriculum, there is a focus on bias, personal identity, as well as activism. I have seen that play out in my own son's English language arts classroom, where in conjunction with reading some standard texts, they also had to do a, quote, implicit bias unit that drew literature essays from a New York Times project, where the entire focus was on negative experiences that students of color had had with white people, neglected from that project, but also available to the classroom were perspectives other than that. And so they neglected an opportunity to indicate that the topic of racism is a human problem. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, we have Mark McCormick. Welcome.
Thank you. My name is Mark McCormick. I am Director of Strategic Communications at the ACLU of Kansas. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan civil rights and civil liberties organization. Thank you for the opportunity to address you here today. The invitation that we received to present this afternoon included a message that Chairman Williams believed that something called critical pedagogy was being taught in Kansas schools, and that she further believed that this pedagogy saddled white children with the sins of their ancestors. She was kind enough to drop by before the session today and say that that was incorrect, but for the purposes of my testimony, I'd like to continue. In journalism school at the William Allen White School of Journalism at KU, we were taught to check things out. Even if your mother says she loves you, check it out, said one of our most famous editors, John Brimner. So that's what I did. I placed a call to the largest school district in the state, USD 259 in Wichita, where I'm from, and asked if critical pedagogy or critical race theory were being taught there, and I received a firm no. My colleague from the Shawnee Mission School District said neither critical pedagogy nor critical race theory were taught there either. Now, I realize that I was invited here to discuss this subject, but I must respectfully reject this framing. It seems to begin and end with the fundamental misunderstanding of our state and national history. It cynically suggests that all white people are on one side, all black people and other people of color were on the other, and that's not only untrue, but it's a dangerous and unfair rendering. I cannot in good faith entertain this assertion that masquerades as fact. Now, what I can do is discuss the benefits of a more robust study of our history. What I can do is discuss what seems to serve as the underlying fear related to that more robust study. What I can do is try and put those fears to rest. As the former executive director of the Kansas African American Museum and a former executive board member of the Association of African American Museums, I was often confronted with questions about whether it was even morally defensible to fund museums, given the budget constraints, not just here in our state, but nationally. Our response was always direct. Studies have shown that visits to museums, an arm of public education, make students more tolerant, inspire students to grow and to stretch and to learn, to make students more compassionate, make students better citizens, make them want to engage civically and to contribute to their communities. These forays into history give students critical thinking skills, cultural literacy, creativity, curiosity, knowledge, and understanding. Taylor Branch, the noted historian and author, said, "History is the language of civics." Essentially, that without a proper understanding of our history, we fall short in our duty as citizens. In his work writing about the civil rights period, roughly from the Brown decision of 1954 to Dr. King's death in 1968, Branch said the freedom movement freed white citizens as well as African Americans. It broke, quote, the grand circle of fear and helped close the emotional distance between the races. Please don't hurry by this idea. Branch is saying that a more complete rendering of our collective history could liberate all of us. The only barrier is a fear, an age-old fear. As I wrote in an article last summer, the late historian John Heinrich Clark explained the dominant subculture's preoccupation with manipulating history. Europeans began manipulating history in the 15th century to justify the slave trade, said Clark. Modern racism incubated during this period. This later became a way of justifying Jim Crow and all that came with it, from voter suppression, housing and school segregation, and other forms of discrimination. It became a way to maintain the status quo, where people of color and women were squished into society's margins, virtually out of sight and out of mind. But this segregated history is unfair, not only to Black people, but to the heroic efforts of the white people who fought on the right side of history. It is unfair to John Brown, who was featured in a dazzling mural in this very building. It is unfair to William Allen White, the revered Emporia journalist, who ran a third-party gubernatorial campaign to fight the insurgents of the Ku Klux Klan in our state's politics. It's unfair to the Reverend James Reeb, the native Wichitan who died in Selma, marching for African-American voting rights. Today, there's a monument to Reverend Reeb there in Selma. That seems to me to be something that we could all be proud of. Most of all, it's unfair to send white students the message that their only tie to the past is racial tyranny, when that simply wasn't the case. There were and are pitched battles over the soul of this nation, battles between our better angels and our ugliest impulses, as John Meacham reminds us fairly often. We don't think the legislature should be censoring this history. We don't think these efforts at censorship prepare Kansas students for the most diverse America ever. Conversely, we favor honesty in education. And to Representative Williams' concerns about white children feeling bad about this history, the only way they'd be disappointed would be if they were cheering for the Confederacy, cheering for Jim Crow, cheering for the deputized mobs who bloodied the late John Lewis, and cheering for the people who killed Reverend Reeb. Myths, said journalist Jelani Cobb in a recent interview, can powerfully shape our reality. And that's precisely why I saw no value in discussing critical pedagogy, because it feels like the same old myth-making and fear-mongering that, frankly, we need to dispose of. Here's the truth. Race was an organizing principle in the formation of this nation. Any racial reckoning requires an understanding of this fundamental fact. From the 3/5 compromise to the Dred Scott decision to today, we don't arrive at truth until suffering speaks, and we need to begin this process right away. That said, I'll leave you with remarks from the late historian John Hope Franklin from a lecture he gave back in April of 1969, 1 year after Dr. King was murdered. He says this: if there was slavery, injustice, and unspeakable barbarities, the selling of babies from their mother, the breeding of slaves, the lynchings and the burnings at the stake, and discrimination and segregation, these things too are part of the history of the United States. If the patriots were more in love with slavery than freedom, if the founding fathers were more anxious to write slavery into the Constitution than they were to protect the rights of men, and if freedom was begrudgingly given and effectively denied for another century, these things too are a part of our nation's history. It takes a person with a stout heart and great courage and uncompromising honesty to look the history of this country squarely in the face and tell it like it is. But nothing short of this will make it possible to have a reassessment of American history that will in turn permit the teaching of the history of Negro Americans. And when this approach prevails, the history of the United States and the history of the black man can be written and can be taught by any person, white, black, or otherwise, where there is nothing so irrelevant in telling the truth as the color of a man's skin. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Mark. We next have Denise Roberts. Welcome.
I may go over 10 minutes. I'll do my best. I'm supposed to bend my knees so I don't pass out. Good afternoon. Thank you for the privilege of addressing the committee today. My name is Denise Roberts. I am not an expert on education or a professional in the field of mental health. I'm an engaged and invested parent of 3 children, and I'm here today to speak to my lived experience. My easygoing second child has always enjoyed school, both academically and socially. In 6th grade, she began expressing anxiety and stress over social situations, specifically the idea that some girls were using pronouns as a power play. It worried her that something she said without ill intent was being perceived as aggressive and insulting. If you have experienced an early adolescent girl, you will know that they can be obsessive over the health of relationships. In October 2021, I received notification that surveys would be performed on students before and after the so-called second step social emotional learning lesson. Permission was requested with instructions to call KDHE with any questions. Our district was apparently partnering with them in a bullying prevention program. I called that number and messages left were not returned. So I asked my son, age 11, what is second step? He said, that's just circle time. We don't really pay attention. My daughter, though, now in 7th grade, responded differently. She said, remember last year when I told you girls were being mean about pronouns? That's second step. So I went to the experts, I Googled, and I started learning all that I could about CASEL, Committee for Children, and second step social emotional learning. Because that's really difficult to say, I'm going to refer to that as SEL from now on. What is SEL? The Kansas Education System's accrediting body's portrait of a high school graduate includes social emotional factors, measured locally, which are consistent with non-academic soft skills. In December 2021, in testimony to the special committee, a state Board of Education member stated that social emotional growth was even more important to student success than academics, and that academics should make up 15 to 20% of a student's total education. This was based on feedback from listening tours across the state. Research suggests that SEL skills are malleable, meaning they can be taught and learned. Long-accepted psychosocial developmental theory defines early adolescence as the most critical period for the development and content of identity, to include feelings, beliefs, and attitudes. The goal of SEL is to influence students' perceptions of themselves, others, and their environment. So that I am clear, if we are talking about my child's feelings, perceptions, and attitudes, and a survey is being performed before and after the SEL lesson, then what is being sought is evidence of change in my child's feelings, perceptions, and attitudes. According to the Kansas State Department of Education website, the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, or CASEL, provides the model for SEL standards. In 2019, CASEL announced a 3-year strategic plan to prioritize advancing SEL in the service of equity and excellence, ensuring integration of SEL throughout the instructional process. This fits well within the KSDE rubric for diversity, equity, and inclusion, which calls for system-wide social emotional instruction, policies, and practices to be fully embedded in school culture. Per CASEL, this is a new emphasis on the strengths, experiences, and identities of all students, especially those who've been marginalized and minoritized by our society. This new approach is designated transformative SEL. The aims of the new format are redistributing power to promote social justice and helping cultivate change agents and leaders, and these are to be woven into the daily life of school. According to CASEL, transformative equates to emphasis on identity, marginalization, equity, just communities, and the collective. In this setting, students and teachers collaborate in a never-ending cycle of critiquing societal structures, examining their own identities and biases, and working together to become change agents with the goal of becoming collectively effective. SEL proponents, referenced by CASEL, claim that transformative SEL is necessary because dominant groups, especially upper-income white people, affix blame on the disadvantaged for their life circumstances, justify unearned privilege, and engage in dehumanization, commodification, and marginalization of large segments of the domestic and international populations. According to CASEL President and CEO Karen Naimi, SEL is diversity, equity, and inclusion, and can be used as a lever to implement so-called equity and anti-racism. CASEL partners and contributors include the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, and the Novo Foundation. I have attached goals for each entity with my testimony. Some of the SEL research that I relied upon heavily was actually funded by the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. So they fund the research that props up the standards, and they fund the company that dictates the standards. Also note that the seed money provided for Panorama, the company that does these before and after surveys on our children, was also provided by the benevolent Mr. Zuckerberg. Per an article from the American Federation of Teachers, transformative SEL is, quote, animating critical self and social analysis and action, and engaging in a cyclical process of action, assessment, reflection, and adjustment. In other words, the work is never done. According to Yeager et al., who's now employed with CASEL, when SEL becomes transformative, it will effectively address issues such as power, privilege, prejudice, discrimination, social justice, empowerment, and self-determination. My conclusion is that SEL learning does not mean what I would have guessed. Transformative SEL aims to train children as tools of social justice. My children are not tools. I have spent hours with CASEL's publications, webinars, and sample lessons. What I found was that this brand of SEL is based on ideas like deconstruction, intersectionality, standpoint epistemology or lived experience, whiteness, anti-racism, social analysis from a capital C critical theory lens so as to develop a capital C critical social consciousness, identity, and systemic power. These ideas are put forth as objective truth and not merely supposition. If you have been brushing up on critical race theory, you will recognize these ideas to be hallmarks of the theory, which it turns out is actually quite specific and does not mean everything under the sun as has been reported. Second Step is a product of Committee for Children, who states that SEL is fundamental to achieving social justice. A matrix is provided by the Committee for Children that incorporates CASEL and Learning for Justice lessons into the Second Step program. This was designed to be used to incorporate diversity, equity, and social justice in the classroom in elementary and middle schools. Learning for Justice, founded by the Southern Poverty Law Center, is a leader in anti-racism and anti-bias training. This work is intended to begin at the kindergarten level. In middle school, kids are provided opportunities to reflect on fairness and discrimination, examine their own biases, and explore different aspects of gender. Children are also taught the facts about sex assigned at birth, sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression, and how to advocate for LGBTQ youth. Second step discussion-based curriculum is done in the classroom and includes videos, embedded links, and prompts for discussion of admittedly sensitive topics. To my thinking, this is essentially a group therapy session that could potentially be uncomfortable to both students and instructors. A male 6th grade teacher has disclosed to me that he is uncomfortable discussing some of the subject matter with children. I wanted to see Second Step for myself, but it's copyright protected. Moreover, as a Kansas resident, I do not have the right to view it, even though it is labeled curriculum and is used in the classroom. In the state of Utah, however, parents are entitled to view all curriculum, and I found a group in Utah who had done an extensive review of the program, which is published online. I personally contacted the 2 women who spent 30 hours with the program under supervision in their administration building and wrote the review. After a 3-hour Zoom call spent looking at the material, I can summarize by saying it is exactly as expected given the source: social justice, equity, identity, introspection, self-analysis, allyship, civic engagement, activism, and on and on. Society is viewed as collective. Instead of "don't be a bully," kids are now told standing up to bullies is their duty. The golden rule has been redefined as treat others as they wish to be treated. References to adults either suggest or directly state that adults today are not able to understand the issues that kids are facing. Children are told to contact a trusted adult, but never a parent. If mentioned at all, parent is given the role of antagonist. Erickson's theory of psychosocial development informs us that adolescents are at their most vulnerable in terms of identity at this stage. A teacher taking on the role of identity counselor for all students in a group is problematic. Traditionally, identity integration is to be done with feedback from peers and self-reflection, not teacher feedback. By the very nature of their role, a teacher is an authority figure from whom a child must seek approval. After all, the teacher assigns the grade and makes the rules. I'm reminded of the Ash experiment on conformity. The pressure to conform is immense, and these are children. In almost every scenario provided for the kids to examine in Second Step, the underlying message applies to ideas of power and privilege and how identity politics is playing out in school. Unit 2 is focused on harassment, but harassment and bullying are solely based on identity groups. I'm going to skip a lot of this so that I can explain to you all why I'm here. Just skip some. I am profoundly aware that I am standing in the state capitol building in Topeka, Kansas, the birthplace of Brown versus Board of Education, and I cannot express the respect that I have for this building. I do not wish to dishonor it, but I feel that it is necessary for the committee members to understand exactly and specifically what is being peddled to children under the guise of social-emotional learning. This is supposed to be about supporting our children's mental health. In testimony in December, a State Board of Education member told us that the #1 concern voiced by the community regarding students was mental health. She stated, "We all know good mental health is important to student achievement. Who is responsible for my child's social and emotional growth? Who is responsible for my child's mental health?" I'm going to tell you what motivated this parent to come to Topeka and stand here nervously before you to tell you our story. On November 2nd, I was told by my 12-year-old that a substitute school counselor pulled her from class and discussed scheduling meetings with her on a weekly basis, a so-called intervention. This was done without our knowledge or consent, based on a survey that was performed despite our opting out. Upon my inquiry, I was informed that this intervention was done by a social work practicum student and that meeting with a counselor weekly was considered surface-level intervention. Thus, parental notification is not required. Based on my research of social-emotional learning, this particular parent no longer trusted the judgment of our district or its social workers. SEL is a worthy goal, and great results from these efforts has been reported in the past. This occurs when specific issues are addressed with specific students with the help of qualified professionals. However, once the idea of transformation is introduced and embedded into pedagogy at every level, top to bottom, inside out, what emerges is at best an unqualified social experiment and at worst an effort to engage children toward a goal of fomenting dissatisfaction with and resentment toward institutions of Western society, to include the nuclear family. In early committee meetings, Senator Molly Baumgartner expressed that parents have 2 priorities. Is my child safe, and will my child learn? The answer for our family was emphatically no. We have chosen to withdraw our children from the Shawnee Mission School District. I do not expect we will be the last. I have no control over the reception of my testimony, but I'm compelled to voice it nevertheless. Thank you all.
Thank you, Denise. And I'm going to ask us a little bit of a rearrangement so that we can expedite the questioning process. So for IT, Would you be willing to move closer to Gabby and allow your chair to, for Denise and Tamara, if you would use one chair here and pull another chair up and use this microphone? Or actually, this microphone, yeah. And then Nick, if you could use the upper microphone and put it on the other side and have Mark and David move over here. Does that make sense? So you're basically going to sit on the inner table. You're going to sit on the inner table. Otherwise, it will, yeah, bring one chair each. So I think there's one chair here, and then you'll need to bring one chair. And then that way, the point is that you don't have to get up, sit down, stand up, sit down. So you can just share your microphone between two here. And ladies, you can share that one that's on the podium. Pull the one from the podium down. Okay, and you will have to hit the button when it's your turn to speak. And we'll go in groups of two, and we'll switch who leads from one group to the next. For your questions, again, try to be concise, and that way we'll all have an opportunity to ask a question. And we will do those members that are present first, then those members that are online that would like to ask a question, and then finally, if time is available, for a couple minutes, 1 to 2 minutes of closing statements. Thank you very much, each of you, for giving your testimony on critical pedagogy today. So we'll start with Representative Owsley.
Madam Chair, at the risk of not being able to ask a question, I'd like a little time and to be able to hear other questions and wrap my head around what I just heard and gather a little bit of the understanding of the frustration. I've got a child in an elementary building, a middle school building, and a high school building, and I'm not quite sure I understand why we're here.
Okay, Representative Owsley, then we'll just take that as a pass. If we have time and you think of a question at the end, then we'll come back to you and you can ask that question at that time. Representative Estes.
My question is to the...
The question will be for everyone.
Okay. Your testimony shocked me that you as a parent don't have the right to view curriculum. So I would like to know if that's everybody's experience, and can I come in and look at the curriculum that you mentioned in your written testimony?
You're welcome to come in and look at anything that you want.
And so the question is curriculum available for parents to view? And so Mark, that's maybe not relevant to anything you do, but you may respond. Each person may respond.
I should mention that I have kids in the Blue Valley
Okay.
School District as well. I haven't had difficulty accessing it. I could access it through my child, but I'll leave it at that.
Okay. And make sure your microphone is on. And pull it close to your mouth.
Yeah, it would vary district by district. As to Blue Valley, there is much available online. But I don't know that anything requires the district to make available the curricular materials.
When we asked to see the group equity training,
Microphone.
sorry, we were informed that it's copyright protected, so we're not allowed to view it. Second Step is also copyright protected. They offer sample lessons, but these sample lessons are not at all reflective of what's actually contained. And I would add that with Second Step specifically, this is done in the classroom, and the teacher facilitates. So Second Step sometimes has a video that they'll show the kids, and the kids get a handout, but it is designed to be discussion-based, so it is led by the teacher. So whatever comes up in the session, that's to the teacher's discretion, and I think the kids just take it where they want to go and where everybody's comfortable with.
Mm-hmm. Representative Penn.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you all for being here today with your testimony. There's so many questions I wanted to ask. Wow, we had testimony about USD 259. You were told that this was not being taught, and I wanted to ask the question, why did someone lie to me with that? Because I actually printed it all off before they took it off of the website. But I'm not going to ask that question. Here's my question. In their own words, critical race theorists say that they reject two values that came out of the civil rights era. Number one being that they reject wholeheartedly the theory or the notion of colorblindness, whereby you interact with people on basis not of their color, but just because they're a person, or you create laws not with a thought toward color. Critical race theorists also reject the idea of integrationalism, whereby you have the races living amongst each other, in favor of something that they call race consciousness, that you look at everything through a racial lens. My question to you is, how is that in keeping with the teachings, the life, the legacy of Martin Luther King, who said that in his I Have a Dream speech, that we were all going to hold hands together, sons of slaves and sons of former slave owners, and sing at the table of brotherhood, free at last? How is critical race theory in keeping with the legacy of Dr. King, if that's what you are teaching the kids?
Representative Penn, I appreciate that you asked your question and you put it in the subjunctive if, because in fact, nothing in terms of what you said has any relationship at all to what we're doing in the Shawnee Mission School District. I'm not here to defend critical race theory, but that's not what we do in our work. Still not gonna move.
Get a little cozy.
And I'm sorry to interrupt, but Madam Chair, if after Representative Owsley gets an opportunity, I'll be happy to ask you a question about what you do in Shawnee Mission School District.
I wasn't prepared to come and defend critical race theory. What I will say about your question about Dr. King was that Dr. King also said that he was in favor of a radical redistribution of wealth. Dr. King also spoke at length the year before he was killed about how war takes money away from social programs and social uplift. With regard to the idea of colorblindness, my interpretation of that has been that I am an African-American man, but that's not all I am. But it is an important part of who I am. My parents were born in an all-black town in Oklahoma at a time where segregation was the order of the day. My culture, my family roots are all very important. I wouldn't ask people to just ignore that part of me. I don't want that to be the sole reason or the sole impetus for how they interact with me, but it is an important part of who I am. Not just ignore that part of me. That's what my answer would be.
Tamara and Denise.
Representative Penn, I don't know that I can address Dr. King's legacy or specifically the issue of color blindness. What I would say is that from my experience with my child in a classroom in Blue Valley, where they purport to teach my child about implicit bias and then drive the conversation exclusively toward the topic of anti-whites behaving badly, as opposed to balancing the equation and stating that everybody, no matter their skin color, is human and is flawed and could commit the sin of bias and racism. I find that problematic. So that's the evidence that I've seen in my own child's school.
Specifically to your question of colorblindness, all staff will be required to take the deep equity training in Shawnee Mission. Everyone will be onboarded into this training. In the training, Gary Howard specifically says that we need to dispense with the idea of colorblindness because that's actually disrespectful to be colorblind. I would also add that our district has rewritten its non-discrimination policy and is actually now, according to their strategic plan, developing and promoting hiring practices that seek and prioritize opportunities for minority candidates. So I would tell you that they are not at all colorblind.
Representative Hoffman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Madam Chairman, sorry. I'm struggling with a question that can be answered by everybody here, but I will say maybe one little statement is that I believe that if we want to really teach history, you know, the slavery has been going on for thousands upon thousands upon thousands of years, and our Declaration of Independence, our Constitution, was probably could be the nail that started the ending of slavery. Yeah, it took us another 100 years, and it's taken us even longer to get through some of the other parts of being equal, but I think that is something. And so when we talk about teaching history, I think that is something that can be taught. But I guess I'm a little frustrated because, again, we asked someone from Shawnee Mission to come up, speak to us about what they're teaching, and again, we got a bureaucratic answer. We got nothing. You gave us no specifics about what you teach. And if I was to just simply ask the question, am I to believe that Shawnee Mission looked at your graduation rates, you looked at who was succeeding and who was not succeeding, and your answer was, we're racist here at Shawnee Mission, so now we're going to start this curriculum in order to fix that?
Response.
Not sure how to answer that. Nothing in what I said implied that we called anybody racist, so I'm not sure where to go with it. I guess what I would say to you is that when we looked at the charge we got from our community to make sure that we had equitable outcomes for all of our students, that did require us both to look at our data and understand where we weren't being successful, and then to develop work in order to make that happen. As I said in my statement, and it's in my written statement as well, that work is around making sure that we, as the adults in the system, the staff, the teachers, that we are able to ensure that all of our students feel a sense of connection and belonging. That's not about making judgments about the way anybody else thinks or feels, but it's about creating space for all of our students, Black students, white students, Hispanic students, students whose second language is English, all of our students. That's our work. And it's not about calling anybody racist.
I don't think there was a question there for me.
Would you like to respond? Okay, Denise. Well, you can ask the question, but he won't be able to respond.
That's fine.
Tomorrow? Okay, I'll go with the next question. First, before I ask my question, I will say, because these are public documents, and the testimony that was provided by Mark McCormick did say something in here that I had not said or conveyed to you, which was the statement that pedagogy saddles white children with the sins of their ancestors. I don't believe I've ever said that, nor have I asked anyone to convey that to you. And secondly, the topic of history that was referenced throughout your testimony, history has never been the main topic or even a focus of topic in the interim or in our meetings. So it has never been history for the reasons that I brought you all here today, and I'm very thankful that you're here. So I just wanted to clear that up because this is a written document. My question is, and I would start with David, it relates to deep equity, and then of course I would like you all to respond. And it's more of a question on not necessarily deep equity itself, but the examples that I give you. Are they examples of application of critical theory? And I'm going to use some of the quotes that you gave, David, that I really liked. And you said, relentlessly create full unified culture. Love that. Honor diversity. treat each person with dignity and respect. I think we can all agree that's very important. Sense of belonging for each student. And Mark talked about engaging civically, all very, very good things. We also heard testimony that Dr. Ibram X. Kendi said that there's no ethical difficulty with discrimination if it yields equity. So that kind of is two pictures of how we are going to look at this question that I'm going to present to you. My question is, based on the comments that you provided about what deep equity provides, and based on what we know of authors of critical theory say, what would you and how would you define the activities that are being conducted through deep equity, through the instruction that was provided by Gary Howard for deep equity teacher training that is now being used in the classroom? And I will provide you the actual examples. And my question to you, whether you're familiar with it or not, is this an example of critical theory and application? And if so, or if not, do you think this is good and healthy for children? So here are the examples. Whiteness Walk. Gary Howard also tells in his training video that a young middle school girl goes up to him and says that she wants to rip off her white skin. So remember, the question is this healthy for our kids? Gary Howard, a head of Deep Equity, says he wants to shut down criticism, which most often comes from white people, males, social study types, and conservative Christians, and other negative people. He also says that these programs are, and he gives specific pages for white children in particular, to offer them a balancing of the negative roles that white people have played in maintaining a system of racism with concrete stories. By the way, that diversity lesson goes as young as kindergarten. Affinity groups that are being used, I believe now, that are segregated by race. Whiteness is labeled a condition used throughout Deep Equity. You can, let's see, the opposite of poverty is justice. The good of the many offer the good of the few. Marxist theory is in Deep Equity. There is a white people documentary and reflections. What does it mean to be white? The racial affinity groups are to embrace, excavate, and reckon with their whiteness, including their privilege and power. Discuss the impact of white supremacy culture and the pressure to assimilate, so colorblindness and integration are out. And then finally, this is important, the white affinity groups. Instruction provided to teachers for the white affinity groups in Deep Equity training. They support, the white affinity groups, they support what is forbidden, forgotten, and unhealed. For example, white people can discover together their group identity. They can cultivate racial solidarity and compassion and support each other in sitting with the discomfort, confusion, and numbness that often accompany white racial awakenings. And finally, in the rubric for the racial group for white children, it says what you are not to do with white folks, F-O-L-X. White folks with an X, you are to educate them and not to coddle them. Do these examples sound to you that they are creating a unified culture? You're honoring all diversity. You're treating each person with dignity and respect. And do kids feel more belonging or less belonging when they are separated by their race? David, you may take the first comment.
That was one of the more complex questions I've ever heard. What I can tell you is this: I'm not an expert on critical race theory, so I can't take it in that direction. But the examples you gave are not things that we have done in the trainings in our district. So those may be things they may be quotes you have from Gary Howard or things that may be in a manual, but that's not what the training was in our district.
Okay, so you're saying those activities, those affinity groups, those conditions are not from your district?
That's the complexity of the question. Yes, we do have affinity groups, not necessarily in the way that you describe them, but we do create space for students to get together. One of the things we talk about a lot is the importance of student voice. We need it. In order to be the best at our work as that we can be, we need to hear from our students. We need to create spaces where students can feel that connection, can talk amongst themselves. But I would not describe our affinity groups in the way that you have.
And just to note, I did get that straight from your deep equity curriculum. Mark?
I am not a practitioner of deep equity. That question really seemed like it was for David.
Actually, it's just in general. Do you think that those types of activities are examples of critical theory? Or do you think, if you don't want to go with that question, do you think those examples are helpful to children? And do you think that they create inclusion, respect, and dignity?
I think there is a real danger in taking some isolated incidents and extrapolating them out into something societal. That would be my response.
So you do not want to comment on whether or not you think that if that were your child that were separated out by color, how would you feel?
I did respond.
Denise?
I actually own the Deep Equity and all of the DVDs. And when we approached the district about our feeling that it was problematic, we actually spoke with a board member and were told that they don't use all of the Deep Equity program. And that was one of the things that appealed to them, is that they could pick and choose which portions they want to use. My question to the district was, I was able to find things in about an hour on the internet regarding Gary Howard that made me question why you would even let him in your home, much less in your school, and put your teachers at the mercy of this man. He's, I'll leave that alone. But I will say, it goes back to there's just a little bit of gross in the brownies. If there's so much problematic content within the Deep Equity program, and we gave them, I think we're close to $1 million now of taxpayer money, could we not have found something more suitable? The Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism offers free curriculum, free teacher training. I've asked the question several times, who passed Gary Howard's name across the table, and no one can tell me. I guess I'm not allowed to know who arrived at choosing Deep Equity for our district. The reason that I got involved with this is when I saw it, my first thought was, how dare you tell these teachers in this district that the quote-unquote significant disproportionality that didn't exist until 2019 is because of some implicit bias that they carry. In Shawnee Mission, we've had some of the best teachers I've ever encountered in my life, and I took personal offense that our district would tell our teachers that students are not succeeding for no other reason than their implicit biases. Thank you.
Mark? Okay.
Thank you, Chairwoman, and thank you so much for everyone for coming out today on this issue. It's really disheartening to see when we're talking about learning about equity and justice that history doesn't go back to the indigenous peoples, and I heard that in the testimony today. My question is, studies have shown that Native American students suffer psychological distress because of Native American mascots. With so many Kansas schools using Native American identities and imageries as mascots, how do we address the cultural misunderstanding of these without a deeper study into systematic erasure of Native American culture in the late 19th and early 20th centuries?
I guess there are a couple of ways in which I could reflect on that. There's the piece of it that has to do with those overt symbols, such as mascots. And that's something that in Shawnee Mission, we had to address, and our board did. And our board passed board policy that required one of our high schools and 4 of our elementary schools to change their mascots. And that happened over the last year and a half. And that was incredibly important work that needed to happen. The other part of it, and I think Mr. McCormick can say more about this because he talked about it, is in the teaching of our history. And I would agree with you that we need to teach an honest and broad history and start not with when European settlers came to this country, but to really begin with the history of this place that we all call home. Some of that will be difficult, but we need to tell an honest story about who we are and how we came to this place.
I would echo those sentiments and simply say, to reiterate what I was saying in my testimony, that we have to get more comfortable telling the absolute truth about what happened, that there is a circle of fear that has kept our country back, that one of the things that I've kept in my mind was a comment from a documentary filmmaker, Ken Burns, who was talking about being 10 years old, and his mother was in the bedroom dying of cancer. In the other room on the television were news reports about what was happening in Selma, as I mentioned before. And what he says was that he grew up having difficulty discerning between the cancer that was killing his mother and the cancer that was killing his country. And that until we can fully confront these issues, there's this rot that's in the country that we can't remove. So, to your point, I think what we absolutely have to do is start addressing these issues and these questions head on and be more concerned about the actual hurt that some people are enduring versus hurt feelings.
I would like to add that for my children, I want a thorough and robust review of American history from all angles concerning all peoples who live on this continent. And that is going to require a very careful selection of learning resources. It's going to require people at the district level who know what they're doing. And it's going to require the curriculum providers to step up and to provide those resources so that our children can get a thorough and complete understanding, hopefully, of the entire history of this nation.
I would say I agree with you 100%. Absolutely. I feel like we're getting confused about the issue a little bit. I've never made the statement that we should sanitize our history or that we should only go back to a certain point. I think the issues are getting confused. And I think that where we have veered off, at least in our district and some of the other ones that I've looked at, is our remedy is not addressing the specific problem that we're trying to address. It's doing something else altogether. And to me, that's time that should be spent on what you're referencing. Thank you.
Representative Thomas.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, thank you for giving us an answer to that question. I'm glad you got one. That was very good. As I sit here and think, I'm reminiscing of listening to school board candidates last year who I read on Twitter, I heard with my own ears. Some of them were, and I won't mention districts, I'm not gonna go there, but I will say there are those out there, and the state board can deny it all they want, that celebrate the fact that they are bringing these ideals to their school district. They literally run saying they are bringing these issues. So I think while the state board can deny it as part of curriculum, we know it's there. And the sad part for me personally is when I look at my own family tree, I have 2 black nieces. I have biracial niece and nephew. I have a niece who's Latina. I have a niece who's gay. And guess what? My fear for them is all of these things that we're talking about will start to impact their relationship with me. So it's a huge concern. So that being said, with all of this going on, my question is real simple, yes or no, and I hope to get an answer from everybody. Do you support our parents having final say in what their children learn with regards to any of these subjects? That's really all I want to know, because we've been told, we've heard from nationally people that say parents don't have the right to make those decisions. So my question is, do you support the parent's ability to tell a school that these things not be taught and that we stick to the true history of our country? And I agree with everything we said in the last question. I think all of that is great. I think American history, all the way back, like you said, even further, is good. We need to have that conversation, but it needs to be honest and it needs to be truthful in all aspects, and the personal propaganda needs to be out the door. So that is my question to you all is, do you support the parents' rights to be involved with their students' education and help make choices in what their kids learn?
Certainly, the last part of what you said in terms of the right of parents to be involved, we think that that's critical, that we believe that our work is around creating relationships, not just with our students and our teachers, but also with our parents and our families. That said, with 27,000 students that we serve, I'm not sure from a practical point of view how we might possibly give parents the right to decide on every single specific piece of our curriculum. But we engage with our parents, we hear from our parents, we use parents as a part of our decision-making process, as a part of our strategic planning process. So we feel like we do create ways to make sure that we hear the parent voice in the work that we do.
I would say, sir, that I am involved. There's nothing that happens with my sons that I am not involved in already. And if necessary, I would do as I think one of the other parents here said, they would avail themselves of moving the child to a different school district. I think parents are and should be involved in every decision that comes up that is dealing with their child. Now, whether or not parents are qualified to write curriculum, which I'm not sure that was a part of your question or not, I couldn't answer that. But as a very involved parent, my kids always saw me at school. I knew all of their teachers. I'm a very involved parent.
Denise or Tamara? Either one.
Yeah. Thank you, Representative Thomas. I want to put in my 2 cents and say I'm all for curricular transparency. I believe parents have the right to know what is being taught in their schools. I want to give a shout out to my district. Blue Valley, I believe, does an excellent job with curricular transparency on its website. I can go on the website, for example, and see what the curriculum is for English language arts. They list the novels on there that are approved for every grade level. If a parent has an objection to a novel, that can be brought up to the schools. I think that's an excellent mechanism. I would hope that that would be replicated everywhere. I feel informed. And so I hope that addresses what you're asking about.
As far as curriculum, I think many times if a parent has a question about a specific book that's being used to illustrate an idea, what the district tends to do is point back to the standard and say, this is the way that we're showing this standard. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to point at anyone over there. A lot of the things, see, we keep confusing issue. What we're talking about is the way that ideas are being presented to kids by teachers. A lot of the problems arise, let's say, for example, in an ELA class. The teacher will say, this is the book that we're going to use. It's going to illustrate this specific standard. And then when the kids come to class, discussion ensues. And teachers are presenting ideas to students that line up with what we're talking about. We're seeing increased We received a letter from the principal that said at our elementary school, we're having an increase, a dramatic increase in race-based harassment at an elementary school last year. Has that ever happened before in our district? Not since I've been here. This is about activism. This is about pushing kids to become tools of activism. Stand up, use your voice, find your cause. It's not necessarily about curriculum. I would say yes, absolutely parents should have a say in the curriculum, or at least there should be transparency. But this is a side route. This goes around curriculum. The largest part of my testimony that I cut out, and I'm very thankful that the time forced me to do that, because there were really uncomfortable words that I didn't want to say in here. But in the social emotional learning, kids are pointed to a website, and the first thing that happens is a little box pops up that says, in order to exit this site, you need to hit the escape button 3 times, and your browser history will be erased. That does not suggest that you want parents to know what's going on in the social emotional learning. Moreover, it gives them embedded links to websites where they can go to new places that wouldn't be necessarily called curriculum, but they are suggested within the curriculum. And as a parent, we keep a desktop computer in our kitchen so that I'm aware of what's going on with my kids in that computer. We have parental controls on that computer because we are those involved parents. What we found out this year is when the kids went to remote learning, because they had to dial into that VPN, that bypassed our parental controls. So there are a lot of things, we can say we want parental involvement, but based on what I just shared, to me this says we really want to go around parents when necessary.
Representative Johnson.
Those who ignore history are destined to repeat it. It's the first sentences I give in my class. I truly believe that if we don't look and analyze all areas of history. And so it was very nice when I heard some of these comments. I truly believe that we want that history in our state. We need to search it out. Racial disparity and other issues that has occurred absolutely needs to be shared. The Holocaust, all of these issues. My concern at this point, and I think it's kind of a related issue, and it has nothing to do with what you guys have said, but I sense, at least in some areas of the country, tearing down monuments and artwork, which art and music are so critical to our history. Just your thoughts on how do we prevent that from happening, at least in our state?
And I apologize, I really can't turn and look at you and also talking to the microphone, but I'm referring back to you. I guess what I would say, and I'd relate back to what I was talking about a little bit earlier. At Shawnee Mission North, one of our high schools that had, the mascot was the Indian, and the board passed a policy which required the school to change the mascot. And there were in that building many, many visual symbols of the mascot. And we're coming on the 100th year of that high school. And for the vast, vast majority of its time, that was the mascot. And there are lots of people who have lots of connection to that. And we can't change the past, but we also have to recognize that going forward, to continue to have that symbol as the symbol of the school creates all kinds of challenges for many students, not just Native American students, but many students. So we have removed the symbol. It is no longer the mascot. They're the bison. But we've also kept some of the historical remnants in a place in the building so that we can still tell the story and the complete story of that school and its history. So we didn't just erase and tear down and toss into the landfill those things. We kept them in an appropriate place where it can be told as part of a complete story. Yes, those symbols created many challenges for people, but it's a part of our history. And we can be honest about that and also be honest about the fact that although it took almost 100 years, we finally changed it.
It's a very thoughtful question. I appreciate that. It is a question that I have had to deal with as the executive director of a museum. For many years in Wichita, at the Veterans Memorial Park downtown, there flew a Confederate battle flag. And there was a lot of discussion for quite a while about what to do about that flag. And in a free state, Kansas entering the Union as a free state, it seemed particularly stupid to have that flag flying at Veterans Memorial Park. My solution when I went to, let's just say, a very energetic park board meeting where people were exchanging expletives, was that I thought that the flag belonged at my museum so that I could put it in context. So I could put the quote from Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, who said that the great cornerstone of that nation was based on the idea that the Negro was inferior. I don't think most people knew or understood that. I have since said in articles that I've written that I'm not in favor of tearing these statues down. I think people have become very predictable in their denial about our racial past. I think those memorials are important memorials to this very ugly past, and the fact that they were given prominence in public areas using public money speaks volumes about what our society was and what it continues to be in some respects. So I am not in favor of tearing those things down. I think they should remain right where they are so we can tell the truth about history, as you said, sir.
Although in our school district, we haven't had any changes of mascot or renamings, we have had 4 books pulled from the curriculum because they caused discomfort and contained challenging and hurtful language. The books were Of Mice and Men, To Kill a Mockingbird, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, as well as Huckleberry Finn. I view that as a lost opportunity to teach our kids where we were, how far we've come, and where we might still need to go. I don't think stripping those titles out of the curriculum really does anybody a service. Again, lost opportunity. Lost opportunity.
I think that statues are torn down by activists, and I think that our children should be taught all of this history before we encourage them to tear things down.
Thank you so much, all 4 of you, for those answers. I really appreciate it.
Representative Byers.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As a career educator and looking at the title we began with, I was kind of wondering if we're going to be talking about Skinner versus Glaser and how we look at children as either empty vessels or participants in their own education. But seeing as how we've taken this into the areas of diversity, equity, and inclusion, sometimes we get caught up in the ideas that that revolves simply around race and ethnicity. And as a member of the LGBTQ community, this is where my question comes from. We understand now that nearly 10% of America's youth identify as part of the LGBTQ community. And recently, a study determined that even 3% are transgender or gender nonconforming. We know that trans youth are 5 times more likely to attempt to take their own lives. We also know, thanks to a University of Texas study, that if those kids can get their names and pronouns used at school, at home, at work, that attempt of suicide is dropped by 2/3. So here's my question. if we don't allow discussion of, say, pronoun usage and how it originates with each individual, it is not determined by observation, but is up to each individual as to when and who they tell their pronouns to, how can it be demonstrated that a student's name and pronouns are going to be respected? It starts with the teacher and comes on down. So how do we demonstrate that if we don't get those opportunities to bring that up?
I guess what I would say is that I think we do need to give those opportunities. That these are conversations when we talk about everyone having a sense of belonging. Part of that has to do with all of us understanding what it means to respect another individual's personhood. And that begins with the conversations we have, how we address each other. And I think part of what we're working to do is to create opportunities to have, these aren't necessarily easy conversations, but to talk about these things so that we can create a culture within our schools where every single child feels a sense of belonging. And I do want to be clear, because the vast majority of our children are white children. And when we say every single child, we're also talking about our white children. And when we come into situations where kids feel uncomfortable, those are opportunities for additional conversation, for us to have a chance to work through things. That's part of what relationship building is all about. But I agree with you, we have to talk about those things. Because if all truly is going to mean all, it has to be every single child.
I would agree with David in that sense. There's a proverb that says, because I am, we are. Because we are, I am. It absolutely has to mean everyone. I have just learned this from my conversations with David about the need for schools to connect with absolutely every student. That's what athletics does. That's what the drama class does. That's what orchestra does. That's what all these extracurricular activities can do for a kid. Now, every activity is not for every kid, but for one kid, that one activity might mean absolutely everything. It might mean the difference between them staying in school or them taking their lives. I would absolutely agree that we need to find creative ways to make sure that every kid feels as though they belong. Even if we're talking about history, even if we're talking about Bayard Rustin, the man who organized the March on Washington, the man who convinced Dr. King to stop carrying a pistol. There's room in this history for everyone because everyone participated. That's what I would prefer.
A couple of things. In my testimony, I did mention that. I would be curious to know what the numbers look like for 12 and 13-year-old girls now, because I will tell you, in our experience, they've increased dramatically. Are we considering age appropriateness when we're discussing pronouns? Because what preteen girls do when ideas are presented that this community is powerful and oppressive and this community is marginalized, then 12-year-old girls learn that game really, really quickly. If my pronouns are one thing at 10 a.m. and my pronouns have changed at 12 p.m. and you use the wrong pronoun and I then become angry because you have done something offensive to me, can you see that we're talking about two different things? It's one thing to say, if you prefer a different pronoun, we're happy to use it. My child is happy to use it. What I'm talking about specifically is that becomes weaponized. And so I think when we're talking about some of the second step lessons, some of the places that we're directing 12-year-olds to, that maybe we should talk a little bit about psychosocial development. I'm not in any way suggesting that we don't talk about pronouns. I'm saying that 12-year-old girls do something different with pronouns than what you and I would do. They do what they do with every other difference. At that age level, the whole goal is assimilation, okay? So the idea that we're going in and we're picking at identities at age 12, I think is problematic. Pronouns or no pronouns. So I apologize if that was the way that that was received.
I don't know that I have much to add, except that, of course, all of our students need to feel safe and welcome in their schools. I just hope any conversation regarding these sensitive topics would include three parties: the school, the student, and the parents. That's all.
And finally, Representative Hoy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Hearing all of the discussion and the other questions from committee members puts me in a position now as a parent in the Shawnee Mission School District to kind of circle back and say, how did we get here? And I went digging through my PTA meeting minutes, and we've heard it as a topic about transparency and how can parents have more access. And back on September 10th of 2019, we had somebody from the district come to our PTA meeting, and we talked about the LGBTQ plus program and non-discrimination policies. We talked about diversity, equity, and inclusion, deep equity, in parentheses we had core wing. Social emotional learning, we talked about the panorama assessment and how it was opt-in, and we got to ask questions about the assessment. And it was told that it was 3rd grade to 8th grade, 10,000 kids total. So we had really quite a great overview from the district at this meeting about these a couple years ago. So I just want to let folks get the context of this is a training program that's been slowly implemented, and we got to hear from the teachers at our school that were selected to be the first to go through it. And as a PTA, we were really interested because we are aware that the leadership of our exec board is not reflective of our school community as a whole. So trying to look at that and get some ideas was important to us. So my question is, since parents have a role in helping to amplify the public notice of these things, we had 32 folks in attendance. What are some of the barriers you see that parents aren't able to attend events and meetings and these opportunities to delve deeper into what their kids are doing? And what could we as a state, what is our role of removing some of those barriers? Because if we don't have time to attend a meeting or look at our emails, how are we going to have time to read all this curriculum and all these other things that are being suggested here?
I suspect that is the challenge of modern life, isn't it? I think you're right. We have presented lots of opportunities for engagement, but all of us have incredibly busy lives and so many things to attend to, things that call upon our attention and time. We have to continue to be open. We have to continue to offer opportunities for parents to connect and be involved. We have to encourage our parents, when there's something that concerns them, to come talk to us. Begin with the classroom teacher. Hey, my child came home and told me X. What can you tell me about that? We have to have those conversations. That's part of being in relationship with each other. And if we're going to be successful, it's because of our relationships between students and some of the things that you talked about with regard to the way 12-year-old girls engage with each other. It can be challenging. I have one who was just 12, so I've been there. So we have to work on that. And then part of our work is about creating and attending to those challenging issues. We need relationships between students. We need relationships between our teachers, our students, and the adults, the teachers and other adults in the building. We need relationships between the school and our families. All of those are important. It's hard. I don't know how to manage the complexities of modern life, either for myself personally or for us as a system. But it's something that we have to continue to attend to, because it's important. And if we're going to be successful for all of our children, then we've got to keep asking those questions and keep reaching out.
Forgive me for not facing you but I'm trying to get into the microphone here. This is a question that I've wrestled with for no less than 20 or 30 years. That when I began my work in newspapers, my work schedule was Tuesday through Saturday. And every Monday, I spent the entire Monday volunteering in a neighborhood elementary school. And I said then, and I've said every day since, everyone in society ought to spend some time in public schools. It says a whole lot about who we are as a country, what we value, and frankly, what we don't value. My concern is frankly that we might be asking already too much of schools. We ask teachers to do a whole lot. The teacher that I volunteered with took clothes home and washed clothes for kids that didn't have washer and dryer at home. They might get the only hug they get that day from that teacher. And many kids might get their only meal at school. I am concerned that we might be overloading schools and that those of us who are parents have to take that responsibility and say, don't lie to my child about our history. Do the best you can, and then I'll pick it up from there. But that would be my answer.
I hope I recall your question, and I think, at least what it makes me think of, is the need for transparency, the need to provide means for parents to inspect materials, even those that might be copyrighted, have them available on display at particular times. If I recall your question correctly, it had to do with how do we better inform our parent community. I think that would be a step in the right direction. Just set up mechanisms, set up structures within our districts to let parents know, okay, if you have a question about our professional development curriculum, here is when you can come have a look at what our teachers are being taught, because we don't teach teachers anything that isn't intended to translate to the classroom. So, for example, that will impact your children. So I would encourage districts to be extremely intentional about their openness when it comes to the materials that they're bringing in.
I would suggest that a start would be if our state school board would withdraw from the NASB. I think calling parents who voice concerns, it's intimidating to go before your school board. That's not comfortable. I don't want to be that parent. But then to turn around and denigrate those parents and make accusations like, well, they just don't want accurate history taught. I just don't want my child encouraged to be an activist. They're very, very young. They've got a lot going on in the past 2 years. They're still going to school in masks. They don't get to have their homecoming. They don't get to have anything the way that they normally did. And on top of that, our district has decided that it's important to teach them to stand up, to fight oppression, use your voice. That would be a start. That would be a start.
All right, thank you, committee. I know we may have some legislators that are online, and we are not going to direct questions online. Representative Owsley, I will give you a chance if you do have one final question, and then we're going to close.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I'm going to agree with my fellow SMSD parent over there that some of these questions and presentation, I'm an SMSD graduate myself. I married an SMSD graduate who happens to serve on the school board. We're raising SMSD graduates. My daughter actually was participating in the renaming of the Shawnee Mission Indians. She voted for the Bisons. I guess I would ask the panelists to help me understand how faculty training has to do with educational curriculum. And what do you think the role of the legislature should be in how school districts deal with DE&I? And also, Madam Chair, I thought you said in the beginning you were going to rotate who responded first.
I did, but David went first each time, and I didn't want to interrupt him, and they didn't seem to care as panelists, so I'm like, hey, I'm just going to go with it. And I don't think this is, I think everybody's getting along just fine. So, ladies, are you comfortable with David going first? Okay, so it's okay, David.
I'm totally.
We won't say you're sexist or anything like that.
It's too late. Okay, Representative Ousley, I guess I have no idea what your question was because now I'm embarrassed. I think in terms of the relationship between the training of teachers, I think what we're trying to do is to make sure that our teachers have the skills and the tools that they need to be able to connect across the many things that divide us or that distinguish us from each other. Many of our teachers don't come from the same backgrounds as our children, and that can be in terms of family wealth, it can be in terms of their racial or ethnic background, it can be in terms of gender, it can be in terms of sexuality, sexual preference. All of those things are things that can distinguish our teachers from our kids. But every teacher has to be able to reach every single child. So the professional development work that we're doing is helping our teachers to explore, and sometimes we have to start with ourselves and our own identity to be able to find and make connections to our students and their identities. And that's the work that we're doing, not to make them activists, but to help them to connect with students, find some way to reach every single child. And with regard to the second part of your question about what the legislature can do, I mean, I think that in our wisdom as a country, we chose the model of local school boards. And many, our European ancestors had a very different model, a more centralized, controlled model. But this was a country that as we expanded westward and as we grew, it became critical that schools could speak to the needs of local communities. And I think that that sense of local control continues to be important. And I guess what I would say is honor our history. Honor the notion of local control.
Would you like to go? I can't speak to the first part of your question. I would say that I agree with the idea of local control, that the legislature has a role. I think it should be limited, but I'm not certain that the legislature would know my given community like I do. And I would be much more comfortable with myself and other parents debating these issues rather than having someone take my plate for me, cut my food into small pieces for me, and then hand it back.
I'm going to try to not be rude. Couple of points. In terms of the connection between professional development and the classroom, I think that was the first part of your question. I can draw a straight line between the professional development that was given to Blue Valley teachers, for example, on topics of identity, implicit bias, and trace that through the curriculum and into my child's classroom. So when my child has an implicit bias unit in connection to the study of some literature, well, I can see that bias is something that is to be interrogated as part of the curricular standards. And then I see that every teacher in Blue Valley was run through implicit bias training. So that causes me concern. I mean, you don't train the teachers if you don't want it to impact the classroom. So there is that. Now I'm blanking on
Legislature's role.
Oh, the legislature's role. Thank you. I agree with local control. However, when the state, for example, mandates that social and emotional growth be one of the factors, that is one of the, 5 factors required for graduation for a successful graduate. and then puts links to national entities as the resources for social and emotional growth, curricula, and standards, that does not feel like local control to me. So.
That's also not the legislature, that's the State Board of Education.
Thank you. You're right. But nevertheless, it flows from the state. So that's an impediment to local control. Sorry, Denise.
I'm going to do the same thing. As far as what the legislature can do, I have actually been thinking about that for months, and I don't know the answer to that question. I would say for our family, we pulled our kids. I mean, we chose the home that we chose the community that we chose. It was not convenient to our employment, but we chose it based on the schools. And I was immensely disappointed by how that has gone. So for me, speaking of parental involvement, we pulled our kids out of the district. So I don't know the answer to that question. I wish that I did.
All right, thank you, committee. I'm going to sum up and close up. First of all, I want to thank our panelists because they were very kind to talk on a subject where you didn't have a lot of guidance. And so you were given a topic and you were able to interpret that topic and talk on that topic in the manner in which you chose. So I do appreciate that. I do think that the reason that we are having this discussion is because of parents and teachers that have approached the legislature and their local boards with this issue. It will not disappear. It is here, and we do have to address it. And so the more that we are adults and we talk about it, and we talk about our differences and make sure that we understand what we're defining, because I may be defining something one way, Mark may be another, David another, Denise and Tamara. So, Tamara, I just really screwed that up. So nevertheless, it's important. It's important to talk about it. And so I'd rather for us to do it here than just to have our pent-up frustrations and send an op-ed out and for our politicians to deny that it exists. Let's just talk about it and see what does exist. So thank you very much for the discussion here today. Unfortunately, we do not have time for a closure statements, but I would encourage you, panel, if there are thoughts that you were not able to convey and you would like to send them to my assistant Holly, she would be happy to forward it on to our committee members. Committee members, if there are questions that you had, you do have the email addresses of each of our panelists here today. Also, a little housekeeping, tomorrow we will be hearing a bill. We will be talking about social and emotional learning. And with that, committee.